Well, good evening, family. Welcome to this first edition of Smart Church Amplified for the year 2024. Thank you for tuning in with us. Of course, we always pray God's blessings on you and everything and everybody that's connected to you. Certainly appreciate the fact that you, after our little hiatus, if you will, that you saw fit to come back in. It's probably been a little over 3 weeks since we've been together, and here we are back in community. I hope that in the break you were able to get rest, not from us. Thank you, Brother Donald Lewis. Not from us, but just to kind of pull back from the, as my grandmother would say, ripping and running of life, of all that happens in this capitalistic society, and trying to keep up, and sometimes keep up with the wrong people at the wrong time. But here we are, and it's certainly good for me. I miss our interaction with one another, but I also know, and we'll talk about it some tonight, that everybody needs to give themselves time to rest from the rat race, from the work. We are always grateful and want to express our gratitude for those of you who are watching in the rebroadcast. I don't know when or where this is for you, where you are in the world, because that's what the World Wide Web affords us. I'm just glad that you're here. And if you know anything about us, you know that this is real conversation. I ain't trying to hog the mic. I am just so grateful that we come in this space to teach one another. Certainly appreciate those of you who are new with us. It's a little bit different. I am not a lecturer. I am a facilitator. I try to keep the conversation moving. What you'll notice is that most of the lesson, most of the teaching happens in the chat box, and sometimes it's like we catch fire. Once someone puts a word out, it just triggers something in us. But so please keep your eye on the chat box. We also, as a reminder to some and news to others, we also ask you to keep your sacred scriptures open and read your scriptures as you are led as we go along, and also keep some sort of note-taking apparatus such that you can move write thoughts and go back and read them and let the Spirit teach you in your own private devotion time. This is a safe space. We don't criticize anyone. We might correct in love, but we don't criticize or rebuke in this space. This is a space that we come together to learn, really learn from one another. And you'll notice that we cover a lot of ground, and it is good for us. And by the time we finish a year, we can go back and say, man, God has taught us a lot. We have taught one another. And as the elders would say, we've come a mighty long way. That being said, let's kick off this year. The conversation is about grace. I know that's an old kind of dusty concept or notion. In the modern church, we say favor. But believe me when I tell you or remind you, because I know we already know it, that we cannot make it without the grace of God in our lives. No way, no how. We can't make it. And so these conversations for the next few weeks are meant to remind us, of course, to teach us and to move us to action in some way, shape, or form according to the grace of God in our lives. Our first scripture for the year is Ephesians chapter 2, 8 through 10. The book of Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. If my memory serves me, Ephesians can be found right after the book of Philippians in the New Testament. That is Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. And really, we're mostly talking about verse 8, but, we want to keep the paragraph intact. Excuse me. So I'm going to read from the New International Version. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. Verse 10. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. I'll read verse 8 again. For it is by grace that we have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God. So let's walk it through, and we'll build on and get some great conversation tonight. We'll build on our study from earlier in this paragraph. It is as if the writer um, is not trying to pull any punches, right? No sugarcoating, no walking around anything, and no, the writer goes straight to it. We saved by grace. There's no ambiguity, no gray area, if you will. In fact, the paragraph starts with that it is by grace. Grace is an interesting concept. Let's see. Let's start the conversation. What do you remember? Oh, after Galatians. Thank you, Pastor Raven. What do you remember about what they've taught you about grace, even from your earliest days of Bible study, Bible study, or in Sunday school? What do you remember about what they taught you about grace? What is grace? Those of you who were with us, good evening with us today. I want you to go back further than that. Go back further. Somebody uh, will probably bring up something about unmerited something. What do you remember about grace? Put it in the chat box for us, please. Um, I suppose somebody would answer the question, do we deserve the grace of God? What is it? What is it that you remember about the teachings on grace? Most times, who distributes grace? Is it us? Is it God? Who is it? Help us, please, with your answer, Sister Claire. Sister Rose Trust Class, something we cannot earn. You can't earn it, can't buy it, right? There is no bartering, if you will, for the grace of God. That's a very good unmerited favor. There it is, Sister Nancy. Uh, Grace of God is the unmerited. In other words, just like Sister Trust Class said, you didn't do anything for this. Right? It's favor. Sister Yvonne Sutton said, grace is sufficient. I like that one very much. Grace is sufficient. Sometimes in our flesh, that's hard for us to agree with. Yes. Good evening, Sister Reese. What do you remember about grace? Pure grace is a gift from God only. That's Sister Charlene Anthony. That's a good one as well, right? Usually we are taught that God is the one. As Sister said, pure grace comes from God, from the heart and the mind of God. Of course, that's speaking this word we already know. We're speaking anthropomorphically, that is, giving God human qualities, heart and mind. That's right. So if you remember this afternoon, saved by grace is what Brother Lewis brought out for us. That's right. Um, so grace is akin or similar to the notion of favor. And that is, as you all have pointed out so brilliantly, it is something given to us that we didn't earn. We didn't do anything for it. It's something that God does for us. And remember, we brought up Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, the fact that we are made in the image and likeness of God, because grace suggests to us that favor, if you will, is something that we are drawn to someone or attracted to someone, and therefore we want to show them kindness or show goodwill towards them. And so when we talk about somebody favored us or God favored us, we're talking about that There is something in us that is drawn to God, or no, that draws God to us. And we mentioned Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, because God is really drawn to the God that is in us, right? As his creature, his creation, sons and daughters, if you will, just like we have our parents in us and their parents, and the genealogy goes back as far as the first one. Same way with God and us, that we have God in us, and what draws God to us is not our flesh, not the way we decorate our flesh, um, or not the way that we try to improve our flesh, or change, or whatever it is. No, it is the God that is in us, made in the image of likeness of God, that draws God to us. Sister Lucille Basile says, grace is love from God for his children. Brilliant. Thank you, sis. Yes. See, that's why we in here like this, so we can teach one another. And so, but we also recognize that when you're talking about favor, the word goes back to the notion of a token, and the word comes from the medieval period, when warriors were going out to battle. Um, when warriors were going out to battle, young women would give the warrior a token, maybe a piece of their wardrobe, maybe a small piece of jewelry, to encourage and to inspire the one that was going into battle. Sister Charlene Anthony says, grace and mercy have, I like that. Grace and mercy have a great relationship. Yes, they do. Sister Harriet Reese, God's grace is favor towards here it is, towards the unworthy. I love the fact that you bring that out for us, because it ties into the notion that we can't buy, we can't earn it, we can't barter for it. It is God's attraction to us, that God shows goodwill towards us, shows favor toward us, and as Sister brought out, mercy towards us. And so these warriors would take the token of the young lady's appreciation for what they are doing, and perhaps there's even kind of some attraction there, other than what we are talking about, unholy attraction, uh, so that the warrior is reminded. Well, and I dare not try to diminish God's presence and activity in our lives, but favor ties into our lives, both individually and as community, in like manner. God gives us tokens, if you will, of His grace. Think about every time a prayer is answered. That's a token from God. The emblem of God's grace, because God doesn't have to answer our prayers when the answer to the prayer is the healing that we ask for. And so that means that every time we exercise in the strength to walk, or we are able to move, or we are able to use our brains properly, that's a token, that's a reminder for us that God's grace is real and relevant in our lives. If you think about, right, the ultimate token, and again, I dare not try to minimize or diminish, but think about Calvary's Hill. Think about John 3 and 16. God so loved the world, right? The empty tomb, the promise, the ascension, and then the promise to come back. All of that is tokens. It's reminders for us that God really is on our side, and God is really working all things together for our good. And so when we talk grace, we're talking favor. And when we're talking favor, we're talking that God gives us emblems and signs and signals, tokens, to remind us that God is with us, and that God is for us. When you think about the Genesis passage again, um, it says that God made humans in God's image to have dominion. I think sometimes we kind of miss that in the activity or in the grace of God in our lives. God made us to be in charge, if nothing more than to be the in charge of ourselves and how we interact and move about in the world, right? God has not given us a spirit of fear, but love, power, and of a sound mind. That's an indication that we ought to at least be in charge of ourselves. We are not we are not made, we are not built to be under anybody, right? In terms of people stepping on us, in terms of people misusing us and abusing and all that goes with that, right? No, God made us in God's image and likeness such that we would have dominion. That is to at least be in charge of ourselves. Forget the social hierarchies that are created and put in place by man. We're talking about our relationship with God based on the grace of God in our lives. Sister Geraldine Gatlin, we become Christian through God's grace. It is free. I like that. God's grace is free. I think that's the t shirt moment for us tonight. God's grace is free to us. And we're going to bring that up before we leave, sis. This notion of uh, we become who we are through God's grace. Yeah, Genesis teaches us that we ought to be in charge, that we are in charge. So we ought to act like it. But the other extreme of that is, and we all know these people, is that we act as if it is not God's grace, or some of us will act as if it is not God's grace, right? And so we find those people bragging on themselves more than they brag on what God is doing for them or God's grace in their lives. We all know those people, right? It's all about them and it's all about what they have and what they're doing. And if they mention God, it is in passing as if God blesses them more than God will bless anybody else. Yes, Donald Lewis made it succinct for us. Thank you, sir. We're supposed to be in charge. He says, I am not your stepping stone. That's it exactly. So, yeah, these people who love to call attention to themselves, who brag about or brag on themselves, they have obviously forgot what we're talking about tonight. Is that, as Sister Geraldine pointed out for us, we are saved, right? We are who we are because of the grace of God. And your bank account is not big enough to buy it. So, as we are talking about this notion of grace, favor, um, the tokens that God gives to us, it leads right into the next phrase in the text. The next phrase says, by grace you have been saved. So now we're talking about, and you just put this in your notes, uh, and you can, look at it in your own time. But the academics call this soteriology. I'll put it in the box for us. 'Cause see, I know this is the group that's interested in knowing what is going on. There it is, and not just in what can God do for me. There it is, soteriology. Sister Charlene Anthony giving us James 4 and 6. Get that one in your notes as well. But God gives us more grace. God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. I love that. Thank you for bringing that out, connecting that to our conversation. People who bragging on themselves and it's all about them, and they just hyper, right? Have this huge ego. And Sister Anthony reminds us what James said, right? God opposes the proud. I like that. Let's keep going. Uh, and so we're connecting now grace to salvation, right? We're saved. We're in relationship with God. Sister Geraldine Gatlin pointed out we're Christians, disciples of the Christ because of the grace of God. You know what and I'm gonna get a little bit ahead of myself, but we'll be fine. What it makes me think about is it is by grace that God reveals God's self to us. If you're taking notes, you really ought to write that one down. Uh, it is by grace that God reveals God's self to us, right? Or through the grace of God. Through the grace of God, right? God shows us right from wrong, morals and ethics, wisdom, gives us knowledge. It is by the grace of God that we even know of Jesus and what Jesus did for us, right? How much God loved us. So without grace, we would not even know what to believe. I want you to catch that one. Without grace, God would not have assigned someone to either teach us or tell us about Jesus Christ. And if we don't know about Jesus Christ, now we don't know what to believe. And if we don't know what to believe, we don't know what to do. We're just going around, right? Going with the wind, whatever way the wind is blowing metaphorically. That's the way we're going. But saw God saw God in you, or God saw God in me and was attracted to that and revealed, right? That God so loved the world and revealed that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And because of the revelation, uh, through grace, that we are now believers and can't nobody change our mind about it. Sister Lucille Bazille, God's grace is so powerful that no man can do it for us. It is like fire in our bones. Check that out. So, uh, God is so gracious to us that God will reveal. I'll never ever forget. Is like that thing that the elders say, "As long as I live." This one I know for myself. I was going through a real difficult financial situation at some point a few years ago, more than a few years ago, and it was so bad that now I'm taking out the classified ads to try to see where am I going to live. Checking out houses and apartments and rent, all that stuff, because I just know it's over. I'm going to have to give up my house. And as I am sitting at the table with the paper in my hand, God revealed to me in a still small voice, "You don't need that paper. You're not going to lose your house." From that point on, I never worked. That was grace at work, right? Here I am stressing myself out. Here I am probably about to make a big mistake. And the grace of God stepped in and said, "No, it ain't going down like that. Stop stressing." That's my little story, right? And I know that many of us who are in this conversation now have similar stories, that it was by grace or through grace that God revealed something to you. Don't trust that one. Or God reveals something to you, invest in that, buy that. God reveals something to you, don't turn right, you better keep going straight. Whatever it was, right? And it was nothing but grace. As you all have been pointing out so much tonight, you could not have purchased that with gold bars. It was just God's attraction to you, that God stepped in and said, "No, we're not going to do that." I hope I'm right about that for you. And so when we're talking salvation, by grace, you are saved. When we're talking salvation, What we're really talking about is relationship with God. So much so that the relationship with God would not be possible unless God demonstrated his love for us through his favor, through God's favor, through grace, right? In fact, as you all just keep reminding us, you can't even work for what God does for us. I want you to think about that. Somebody mentioned early, unmerited favor, right? You can't work your way into, and we need to pause right there. Let me, Pastor Bruce Raby, reminding us of Romans 5:2. You need to get that one in your notes. Romans 5:2, by whom also we have access by faith into this grace wherein we stand and rejoice of the glory of God. Man, yes, indeed. I hope you're seeing this grace thing a little more clearly now because we're about to go there. Sister Yvonne Sutton, uh, by the grace of God, all of our good works are planned and I'm assuming, and we are empowered by God. Exactly, right? God designs us and God empowers us to do good works so that God might receive the glory. See, you all are on this thing. I'm blessed because I'm here with you. Thank you. Now look at it, right? It's not by works, it's grace. Pause right there, follower of God, disciple of Christ. Pause right there. Because sometimes the reason we get stuck and the reason we kind of live with this cloud of depression over us is because we keep getting in God's way trying to work it out. Brother Donald Lewis is telling us if we're going to give it one step ahead of me, if we're going to give it to God, we must turn it loose completely and trust his outcome. Must be great minds thinking alike, Brother Lewis. Yes, that's exactly it. Sometimes we get in the way and uh, uh, even with our mind or the way our mind is set, we try to control what we want God to do for us. We can say it like this. Sometimes we want to be depressed. We want to be sad because it gives us a sense of control over our situation. I think I said something important that time. Sometimes we want to be depressed. We want the attention. Yes, that's one. But the second thing is, even in our depression, it makes us feel like we're controlling it. I feel like I want to feel in this situation. And as Brother Lewis has so powerfully pointed out for us, get out of the way and let God change your mind and let God, what's the text say in Romans? Renew your mind and let and let God change the way you see yourself. Many times when we are in God's way, and my therapist taught me this, and I thought it was so uh, uh, relevant and powerful. Uh, he said many times we get in the way uh, because we don't want to feel like we are worthy. Because if we think or feel like we're worthy, then that requires a change in us. And so we would rather feel like things never go my way. I don't have a future. Uh, Nobody's on my side. All of those things that we say to ourselves, even if we just say it in our minds, because if we start thinking, no, I am worthy of moving forward in life, of accomplishing things, of walking with God, right? Whatever the case may be, then that's going to require a change in you. Remember, Jesus walked up on the guy sitting by the pool. I think it was Bethesda, correct me if I'm wrong, and said, "Do you want to be healed?" And he starts out with a litany. Nobody's on my side, so forth and so on, right? And a litany of excuses. And to me, he was just saying, I'm not worthy to be healed. I'd rather just sit here. Perhaps somewhere in his consciousness, he knew that change would have to happen. You can't sit here and feel sorry for yourself. And responsibility would come along with healing or deliverance or salvation. I hope that makes sense to you. Um, and so our relationship with God is given to us by the grace of God, right? Is God favor that gives us opportunity to participate with God. I'll cover that in a little moment, right? Here's another thing. By grace, when we talk salvation, we can explain it another way and say uh, it is God's way of making us whole. Sister Geraldine Gatlin, we will mess it up every time. Let go and let God. Huh. Man, that shines a whole new light on this notion of grace, of submitting whatever it is, like Brother Lewis pointed out as well, letting it go, submitting it to God, and getting out of God's way. Um, yeah, so when we're talking salvation, it is God's way of making us whole. So by grace, we are saved. Another way to look at that is, again, by grace, God makes us whole. That's mind, body, soul. You've heard me say this a number of times over the years, that we serve a God that doesn't save a part of us. God saves all of us, right? God doesn't give you or me or us a place in heaven and just say, well, you just catch hell till I decide to come back for you. It doesn't work that way. God is all up in our lives. God saves all of us. But now that leads us to a question that ties into what we were just talking about, this notion of change and responsibility. The question that we have to answer almost 24/7 is, how well are you taking care of the gift, or scriptures say, uh, the temple of the Holy Ghost or the temple of God? How well are you taking care of yourself is the question, right? Because if we saved by grace and it's a gift, then it suggests that we have to take care of the gift that God has given to us. Maybe we'll come back to that tonight before we're done. Um, so grace leads us to salvation, and salvation comes about because of faith in what we believe, right? So this is how grace works in our lives to help us to understand ourselves and to understand the world around us. I did not make that up. In Second Corinthians chapter 5 verse 7, you'll want to get that one in your notes. Second Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7 is the one that you hear at funerals a lot. We walk by faith and not by sight. Walk, of course, meaning how we live. How will we know how to live except God's grace in our lives? I think what you can see is that when we talk grace, what we're talking about is God's agency, God's activity in our lives. So how will we know how to live is the question, unless God applies God's grace to us. The elders would say we'd be running around with chickens with our heads cut off. I know some of you have heard that one before. And then the writer brings in something else about grace. It's the gift of God that you all have explained eloquently, perfectly for us. But remember, when somebody gives you a gift, what did the elders, what did your mama and them teach you? They don't have to say thank you, but the other part is take care of it. Lucille Bazille, I know God, that if it was not for God's grace, I would not be what I am today. Like the song says, God's grace started me on my way. Yes, yes, indeed. God shows us how to move in this world through his grace. That is wonderful. So yeah, we take care. We take care of the gift. It goes back to what you're doing with the gift of life that God has given to you. Are you honoring God? Are you honoring the one who died on the cross, right? Lynched and is risen again? Are you honoring the elders, the ancestors, right? That poured into you? Or are we wasting the grace of God? Or Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'll have to find Bonhoeffer on the shelf another time for us. That's one you should have, one you should read. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was in Germany when Hitler was rising, right, and came to America. And believe it or not, a German joined and taught Sunday school at a black church in Harlem, the Abyssinian Church. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes about cheap grace. So if we're not taking care of the gift, if we're not honoring God and God's sacrifice for us, then we're treating God's grace like it is cheap, like there's nothing to it. So we have to constantly ask ourselves, what am I doing with the gift of grace that God has given to me called life? Sister Rose Trustclair, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins in accordance with the riches of God's grace that he lavished on us. That's Ephesians chapter 1, verse 1 through 8. I think she's telling us verse 1 through 8. You want to read that whole paragraph. Correct me if I'm wrong, Sister Trustclair. Yeah, right? All about the grace of God. So let's go a little further if you have time. When we're talking grace, it is a or the demonstration of the indispensable presence of God and God's movement activity in our lives. As we've been saying, we can't make, thank you, we can't make it without the grace of God. But imagine this, because we talked about how we get in God's way and thus nullify, in a sense, nullify grace. Imagine how full our lives would be, how satisfied our lives would be if we would both recognize and appreciate the grace of God at work in our lives. Right? Then when I'm living by grace, but we walk by faith and not by sight, right? Grace leads to salvation. Salvation is brought about by faith. If I recognize the grace of God, then man, then we could be unapologetic, unashamed, right? My life is my thank you to God. Then we would be good stewards of grace. It wouldn't be so cheap to us. Then we would show the world what determination looks like because of and by the grace of God. Pastor Raby teaching us Romans chapter 6, verse 1. Couple of steps ahead of me, but it makes sense. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace would abound? And you already know the answer to that rhetorical question. Certainly not. Romans chapter 6, verse 1. That's a good one to keep on hand. I'm not going to mess up just because I know God's grace will step in. No way. Even though I know that my forgiveness, when I've done my dirty deeds, right? My forgiveness is based on, is fulfilled through God's grace. Not only am I saved, but I'm forgiven because of the grace of God. But I won't abuse it. I won't treat it like it's cheap, Bonhoeffer. Sister Charlene Anthony hitting us with Hebrews 4 and 16. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. You all are on this grace thing. I love it. So grace, right, reminds us of the presence and the activity of God in our lives, right? It is God's way of showing us. Remember the token analogy, grace, favor, token. It is God's way of showing us that, yes, God is still on our side. I haven't heard from him. I don't feel him. Yes, but the grace, right? I woke up this morning, the grace. Nothing happened to me that I could not handle. The grace reminds me that God is still working all things together for our good. But now let's be honest and let's take a step back. Because the knowledge of grace, yes, it will encourage us. Yes, it'll make us feel good. But we can't talk about grace like Pastor Raby just brought up for us. We can't talk about grace unless we talk about sin. Because grace, one of the major functions of God's grace in our lives is to give us a clean slate. Is to remind us of God's forgiving power. If you want to walk through that kind of passage that Pastor Raby brought out for us, get in your notes. First, Romans chapter 5, verse 20. It reads this way, but where sin abounded, grace abounded much more. Grace is stronger than sin. Grace is stronger than temptation. So that as sin reigned in death, even so grace might reign through righteousness to eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Temptation, sin have nothing on grace. But earlier, same chapter, Romans 5, but this time verse 17, Paul writes, for if by one man's offense, that's Adam, death reigned through the one, much more those who receive abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ. All right, let's see how that looks. First of all, right, grace is the stronger entity in our lives. Secondly, what gives us victorious living over sin, over death, over that thing they told you would never, that habit they told you would never break, over that thing that's had you bound, locked into a mindset or a situation that was not good for you. What makes the difference? It is the grace of God that gives us victory over whatever it is. And so we have to say to ourselves, there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God. That's Romans 8. I hope I'm making sense. Stop me if I'm not. And then we bring in what Pastor Raby brought up for us. First, we have Romans 5 and 20. Grace is the strongest. 5 and 17. Grace gives us the victory over anything or anybody. And then Romans 6, 1 and 2. So should I just go around sinning? Because I know grace is going to take care of it? Certainly not. because we've already died to sin. If that's already dead, if that's already out of your life, if that thing has no more power over you, or that one has no more power over you, then why would you keep inviting it back into your consciousness? Why would you want to be depressed? Why would you want to live like life is a losing enterprise? Why would you want to live like there is no hope and there is no future when we've been taught by the grace of God we have victory over all of that stuff? So yes, I'm going to live life to the fullest because of the grace of God. I hope that's making sense. As Minister Burnell would say, why don't you give me a thumbs up? Give us a thumbs up or some sign that helps, that makes sense for you. Now, in all of this, we have to remember that the very existence of God demonstrates for us that grace is real. What the Reverend Doctor, who's an ancestor now, Reverend Dr. Gardner C. Taylor, uh, I think it was Concord Church in Brooklyn, would say, from Baton Rouge, Gardner Taylor from Baton Rouge would tell us, that talks about the isness of God. God is, and you can fill in the blank after that, the isness of God. And so we keep the reality of God at the forefront of our consciousness because it lets us know, key in on the word know, that if God is real, then grace is real. But remember, earlier we talked about change and requirement or responsibility. This is not about, I've heard of God. I have a casual relationship. People just want a pity party. Thank you all. Thank you. Uh, uh, I have a casual relationship with God. Yeah, I go to church. I pay my tithes. No, what this says is it requires of us that we know God, KNOW, that we know God, that there is intimacy, not in sex, but as in closeness. There is intimacy with God. When you see me, you see God. That's why God says we have to know God. You know God. If you know God, then you know God's grace. And so I need to know that God, whatever God has said, whatever God has promised, it is true. No matter what the situation looks like, no matter what precedence says, no matter what the prognosticators say, right? Precedents pass, prognosticators trying to tell you what your future will be. None of that matters if it's different from what God has said, because everything God says is true and it will happen. It to know God is to know that God will never give you any kind of assignment, whether it makes you feel good about yourself or it brings about discomfort. God will always equip you and God will always empower you. Whatever you are dealing with, whether or not it's heavy, she ain't heavy, she my sister, or whether it is clear skies and blue sailing, you are equipped to handle both the blessings and the trials, and you are empowered to do so. And lastly, to know God is to know that God is working God's plans for you, dear heart. It may be a part of the process is not what you have chosen for yourself, but by grace, right? You will make it because it's God's plans. God has good intentions for you. Jeremiah 29, verse 11. That is the way that we say we know God. So here's the last thing. And to be honest with you, Sister Rosemary Trosclair brought this up at 12 o'clock. And it is so apropos for us. We always talk about God's grace towards us, which is, according to this conversation and according to what you have told us tonight, is the most important, right? Grace, mercy, the most important. But imagine what kind of faith community we could build if we created a culture of grace. Think that through. Write that question in your notes. Go back and meditate on that. If we created a culture of great, imagine the confidence that we would walk in, or the way we would live in confidence. If this were a culture of grace, if we knew that grace was taking care of everything, imagine imagine what it would look like if the same grace that God extends to us, we extended to other people or to one another. I think that's the kind of church I would like to be a part of, where grace is the supreme attribute, right? That if they described us, it wouldn't matter about whatever the name could be. The name could be XYZ. It doesn't matter. But the way they say, those people know God because they love one another, and you can see grace moving about. As you meditate on such, I think we can build it. I think we could build the faith community or the church that we want if we make up our mind to keep grace at the forefront, right? That means that no matter what happens, we learn, as Brother Donald taught us and Pastor Raby has taught us tonight. I'm gonna get out of the way and let God handle. It does not exempt us from doing what we can and trusting God to do the rest. But it does say grace rules in this. Grace reigns. And because God, through God's grace, reigns, then that means we are victorious. It ain't no thing. We can accomplish what we will. Marcus Garvey. Rise, you mighty people, accomplish what you will. Right? Healing taking place in the house. Right? People saved from whatever may be coming about in their lives because of grace, because of the culture of grace. As you're thinking, grace, love, and mercy are in the same family. You're exactly right, Sister Charlene, right? So we can fight for justice, but what good does it do if we can't stand one another? We can hand out thousands upon thousands of plates and give away coats every day and blankets and do all that we do. We can lift up our children and raise them and rear them to run the world. But what does it look like if there's no grace, no love, right? No peace of mind and peace with one another. A culture of grace. We could build that, sister and brother. That's why we're going to talk about it. We can build it. As you're meditating on that, consider Colossians chapter 3, verse 13. Colossians 3 and 13. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long suffering. That's grace. Bearing with one another and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. But above all things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. I ain't lying, man. That's the church I want to be a part of. That's the church that can do anything. That's the church that they would have to say they turning the world upside down. That's the church I want to be a part of. Let's do it. Let's do it together. Let's do it together. Let's employ grace like people have never seen it before. Colossians 3 and 13. God bless all of you. Thank you. This was a wonderful first night. If this is any indication of the direction that we're going, this year, man, you better put on your seatbelt. It's going to be something else. Just before we go, and we'll talk more about this Sunday, leaders, if you're leading anything, if you're planning any event, uh, if you need to hit the budget, then please put that in writing for us. And I'm sure the budget committee will be requiring that very soon. So I'm just trying to give you a head start. Brother Donald Lewis is saying, how can you love God but hate your brother and sister? I know that's right. Yes. Also, Our deacons and deaconess did a lot of digging for us. We had a lot of confusing information. Um, um, but please remember Sister Ruby Allen and our brother, her son, John Allen, and their family. Miss Ruby's son, Michael, has transitioned to be with the Lord. He's an ancestor now. But you know how that goes. Those of us who have had death in our family, it's tough. And so please remember the Allen family in your prayers. I love all of you. I look forward to seeing you either virtually or in person on Sunday. Be careful out there, man. It's rough in them streets with COVID and RSV. And Brother Lewis informed me that the flu is going down. Cases of the flu is going down, but it doesn't mean it's going anywhere. Please be careful. I love you. Peace.